The Mystery of the Petton Family Home and the Sealed Records. In the colonial settlement of Newfield, Connecticut, nestled among church records dating from 1647 to 1685, lies a case that continues to disturb even the most seasoned historians. Over 300 wills were executed during this time, an unusually high number for such a small population. Even more unsettling was the revelation that nearly all of these wills were processed through the hands of three men sharing the surname Pemberton, later revealed to be aliases of the Petons brothers. At first glance, this detail might seem a historical curiosity, perhaps an indication of their prominence in a devout and tight-knit Puritan community. But that assumption shattered in the late 17th century with a horrifying discovery beneath the floorboards of the Petton home. There, hidden in a sealed compartment, authorities uncovered hundreds of glass vials containing residues of opium and belladonna substances known even then for their potent effects on the human mind. Alongside them were leather-bound journals, meticulously recording the dying words of colonists described not in medical or religious terms, but as visions, allegedly divine experienced, just prior to death. The sheer volume of these materials, vials, notes, and so-called transcriptions of divine utterances hinted at a premeditated and chillingly systematic operation. Even more disturbing was a specific pattern those who experienced these spiritual episodes tended to sign over their property to the Petton brothers in the days just before death. In total, 23 individuals died within a week of signing revised wills, and all were reported to have been under the exclusive care of the brothers in their final moments. Witnesses at the time described the dying as being transported by holy rapture, and spoke of their speech turning poetic as though channeling voices from heaven itself. But was this genuine divine contact, or the result of carefully administered drugs designed to disorient the dying and make them more suggestible? When colonial authorities discovered these materials, they chose to seal them away rather than pursue prosecution. At the time, exposing such manipulation by revered community leaders would not only have devastated Newfield, but could have triggered a widespread crisis of faith across the colony. Church and legal institutions were tightly interwoven in early America, and admitting to corruption at the heart of both would have meant casting doubt on the very foundations of colonial life. The case was suppressed, hidden in an archive, and nearly lost to time until centuries later a Yale historian stumbled upon the truth. But that discovery would only come after generations had passed, and the real damage had already been done. 1998, discovery by Yale researcher, a buried case of systematic spiritual fraud. The story of the Petton brothers might have remained a footnote in obscure church records, if not for a discovery in 1998 by Yale historian Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne. While researching the evolution of palliative care practices in early New England, Dr. Hawthorne came across peculiar references in the personal letters of 18th-century theologian Jonathan Edwards. Among his handwritten notes was a veiled warning about false shepherds who used visions and vapors to influence the dying. The phrases were vague but tantalizing enough for Dr. Hawthorne to initiate a deep dive into Connecticut's colonial archives. What she uncovered stunned her team and soon captivated the historical community. Hidden in a misfiled collection at the Connecticut Historical Society was a bundle of fragile documents yellowed with age yet meticulously preserved. Among them were witness testimonies, copied pages from the Peton brothers' journals, and most remarkably, the original diary of Constance Peton, niece to the infamous trio and the case's eventual whistleblower. These documents painted a horrifying picture, a 3-decade scheme in which the Peton brothers gained control of land and assets by manipulating the dying through a cocktail of pharmacological expertise, spiritual theatrics, and legal precision. What disturbed Dr. Hawthorne and her colleagues most wasn't just the scale of the fraud, it was the cold, calculated nature of it. The journals didn't describe visions as accidental miracles, but rather as predictable results of precise chemical dosages. There were clinical notes on dosages by body weight, mental state, and religious temperament. More hauntingly, there were instructions for how to exploit specific grief triggers, mentions of deceased spouses, references to biblical imagery, and the strategic use of family heirlooms during hallucinations. This wasn't just a con, it was a deeply rehearsed performance, one that used the machinery of faith to stage a spectacle at the threshold of death, all for personal gain. Dr. Hawthorne's rediscovery reframed the Peton case not as an isolated incident, but as one of the earliest documented examples of coordinated spiritual exploitation for material wealth in colonial America. Her work has since inspired interdisciplinary studies into the overlap between pharmacology, theology, and law areas that, when intertwined without accountability, can become tools of monstrous manipulation. Arrival in Newfield, Connecticut. Timing and context. To understand how the Peton brothers managed to root themselves so deeply into Newfield society, one must examine the precise moment of their arrival. The year was 1647, and Newfield was a fledgling settlement composed of fewer than 60 Puritan families who had broken away from larger, more established towns in search of stricter religious observance. The land was rugged, flanked by forest and rocky hills, and the winters were merciless. That particular winter had been especially cruel. Food stores were depleted, illness spread quickly, and morale was low. Into this climate of physical vulnerability and spiritual desperation arrived the 3 Peton brothers, Obadiah, Jeremiah, and Cornelius. They came from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, bearing letters of introduction, supposedly written by respected Boston ministers. These letters were instrumental in gaining the trust of Newfield's devout residents, yet they would later be exposed as forgeries crafted with shocking precision to imitate the handwriting and seals of real colonial authorities. This act alone speaks volumes about the premeditation involved. The brothers didn't stumble upon Newfield by accident. They targeted it. The isolated geography, lack of formal oversight, and community hunger for leadership made it an ideal breeding ground for their scheme. Obadiah presented himself as a physician trained in London, a rare credential in the New World, and immediately began tending to the sick with a solemn, composed manner that impressed even the most skeptical settlers. Jeremiah, a gaunt and intense man, took on the role of minister. He claimed education from Cambridge and delivered sermons that blended scripture with hypnotic cadence, captivating listeners into spiritual awe. Cornelius completed the triad by assuming the role of magistrate and legal authority. With his fine clothing and urbane demeanor, he seemed the natural choice to oversee property records and town contracts. Together, they created a trifecta of influence: physical healing, spiritual salvation, and legal control. Each domain reinforced the others. The sick trusted Obadiah and were guided by Jeremiah's teachings, while Cornelius made sure their final words, captured under the veil of divine inspiration, were legally binding. Within months, they weren't just residents of Newfield. They were its foundation. Their integration was so seamless, their contributions so vital, that questioning them felt almost sacrilegious. Forged credentials and calculated infiltration. The Peton brothers didn't merely insert themselves into a vulnerable town, they engineered their arrival with surgical precision. The letters of introduction they presented bore the names and seals of known Boston clergymen and magistrates. Yet later, forensic analysis of these documents, compared with authentic records from the time, revealed the truth these endorsements were expertly forged. The brothers had studied colonial penmanship seal impressions and linguistic formalities so meticulously that even seasoned scribes of the day would not have noticed the deception. It wasn't just clever, it was obsessive. This level of preparation suggests the Petons had done far more than simply identify a target community. They had rehearsed their roles, refined their backstories, and anticipated every potential challenge. Obadiah carried a set of medical instruments that, while authentic in appearance, included tools modified for substance delivery. Jeremiah had memorized entire passages of Scripture, crafting his sermons to evoke emotion and guilt. Cornelius maintained an archive of legal precedents, wills, and contracts, many of which had been annotated to support his later manipulations. Perhaps most insidious was their collective decision to remain unmarried. When asked why they had no wives or children, each gave the same solemn explanation: their calling was to serve, not to be served. In a Puritan context where celibacy for spiritual service was respected, this abnormality raised no red flags. In fact, it further elevated their moral standing. The absence of domestic obligations gave them time and freedom to embed themselves deeper into the town's infrastructure medically, spiritually, and legally. This careful construction of identity allowed the brothers to create a closed ecosystem of power. They were the ones diagnosing illness, interpreting visions, and finalizing legal documents. No one else had the authority or knowledge to dispute them. And because each brother operated in a separate but mutually reinforcing domain, their influence was not just widespread, it was absolute. By the time suspicions began to emerge, it was already too late. They had turned Newfield into a stage, and the entire town was cast in supporting roles. Case of Sarah Holcomb, the prototype. Execution. The true scale and method of the Peton brothers' operation were first tested with the case of Sarah Holcomb, a widow of high standing and one of Newfield's wealthiest residents. Her husband, a founding settler, had left her a considerable estate, 60 acres of fertile land, a solidly built house, livestock, and significant influence within the community. When she fell ill with symptoms Obadiah labeled as consumption of the lungs, the three brothers closed in. What followed appeared on the surface to be a model of compassion and religious piety. Obadiah administered soothing tinctures, Jeremiah provided long sessions of prayer and scripture, and Cornelius attended to her legal affairs. The town saw nothing unusual in this. In fact, many praised the brothers for their attentiveness to a respected elder in her final days. But behind closed doors, a darker ritual was unfolding. According to entries later found in Obadiah's medical journal, Sarah was administered what he termed the elixir of divine sight, a blend of opium and other compounds dosed incrementally to induce a dreamlike pliable state. The notes reveal a disturbingly calculated approach. 15 drops initially. Her grief has weakened her resistance. On the second day, Jeremiah was instructed to speak of heavenly visions and her deceased husband. Cornelius had already prepared documents with blank sections to be filled in according to her divinely revealed wishes. Witnesses later recalled how Sarah, in her final days, seemed transported speaking of heavenly messengers and divine instructions. She referenced her husband and claimed he had spoken to her in visions instructing her to donate her land and property to the servants of God for the benefit of Newfield. These words, transcribed with religious solemnity by Cornelius, became the foundation of a new will signed under the influence of the elixir and witnessed by the very men who stood to gain. When Sarah died, the entire town gathered for her funeral. Jeremiah's eulogy was powerful and moving, praising Sarah's spiritual clarity in her final hours. Cornelius read her will aloud, presenting it as a testament to the divine. There was no protest, no suspicion. Instead, there was awe, a sense that Newfield had been chosen by God, that its spiritual leaders were conduits for heavenly purpose. The brothers' reputations soared, and with Sarah Holcomb's estate now under their control, the Petons had not only tested but perfected their formula for spiritual inheritance fraud, establishing the Ministry of Preparation. Following Sarah Holcomb's passing word of her peaceful death, and especially of her divine visions, spread quickly throughout Newfield. Among Puritans, death was seen not only as a natural conclusion, but often a spiritual proving ground. To the deeply religious townspeople, the idea that a person might receive direct communication from the divine before death felt both terrifying and validating. The Peton brothers, knowing the potency of this belief, began to formalize what they presented as a new form of sacred service, the Ministry of Preparation. Ostensibly, it was a charitable endeavor. Obadiah would care for the body, Jeremiah would tend to the soul, and Cornelius would ensure the dying person's earthly matters were resolved. To the public, it seemed like an act of generosity from three devout men. In reality, it was a finely tuned operation targeting vulnerable individuals, especially the elderly, the sick, and those without close heirs. This triad of influence allowed them to control the narrative from every angle, medical, spiritual, and legal. Each time a patient neared death, the ritual was the same. The elixir was administered, gradually producing increasingly mystical behavior that Jeremiah would guide toward specific spiritual realizations. Cornelius, ever prepared, transcribed these visions into documents that conveniently redirected wealth to the ministry, or more accurately to the brothers. By the spring of 1650, the brothers had acquired at least 4 additional estates. Their holdings now included farmland, livestock, and even a portion of forested land near the town's borders. Yet they continued to live modestly, dressing plainly and donating small portions of food or coin to the church. This modesty was strategic. It fed the perception that they were uninterested in worldly wealth and merely stewards of God's bounty. With each passing season, more families requested their presence at deathbeds. Some did so out of reverence, others out of fear that to die without their guidance meant risking the soul's eternal peace. The Peton brothers had created a spiritual monopoly over death itself, and few dared question it. manipulation of public perception and social control. As their influence deepened, the Peton brothers became masters not just of deception, but of perception. They understood that their greatest shield was the community's belief in their sanctity. Every sermon Jeremiah delivered was an emotional performance that reinforced their divine role. He often invoked themes of spiritual clarity at the time of death, preparing the congregation to accept deathbed visions as holy, unquestionable truths. Meanwhile, Cornelius began organizing what came to be known as Testimony Sundays. These special services invited friends or family of the deceased to speak publicly about the final moments of their loved ones, visions of angels, prophetic utterances, and most importantly, the wisdom of bequeathing property to the ministry. These testimonies served a triple purpose. First, they legitimized the Peton brothers' growing acquisitions. Second, they created immense social pressure to conform. If every other pious soul was experiencing divine instruction to donate land, who would dare suggest otherwise? Third, they sent a subtle warning to question the ministry's practices was to insult not just the brothers, but the sacred memory of the dead. And when someone did express hesitation or suspicion, the brothers responded with chilling finesse. When Elder William Fletcher privately asked Jeremiah about the pattern of property transfers, Jeremiah didn't react with anger. Instead, he bowed his head and gently asked if Fletcher had been struggling with doubt lately. He offered to pray with him, framing the question not as reasonable skepticism, but as a spiritual attack. Fletcher reportedly left the meeting ashamed, later confessing in front of the congregation that he had let the devil whisper suspicion into his heart. By converting doubt into guilt, the brothers built an impenetrable wall of faith around themselves. They were no longer merely men, they were holy conduits. To oppose them was to risk one's standing in both the community and the afterlife. Through public rituals, private suggestion, and expertly crafted guilt, the Petons silenced scrutiny and fortified their empire of control. Constance Peton's arrival in 1664, niece or threat, 17 years into the Petons' reign over Newfield, a quiet disruption arrived in the form of a slender, soft-spoken 16-year-old named Constance Peton. She claimed to be the daughter of a fourth Peton brother who had died in England, and she arrived with a letter from his estate naming her uncles Obadiah, Jeremiah, and Cornelius as her guardians in the colonies. Her arrival was unplanned, at least for the brothers, and while they welcomed her publicly, their private writings revealed unease. From the start, Constance was unlike her uncles. While Jeremiah cloaked himself in intensity and solemnity, Constance radiated a gentle warmth. She helped neighbors with chores, played with children, and listened quietly at prayer meetings, without ever trying to dominate or control. Her devoutness was sincere, but not zealous. Her youth and feminine grace offered a new presence in the Peton household, making the trio appear more familial and respectable, an advantage Jeremiah noted in his journal. Her presence, he wrote, deflects dangerous questions, but Obadiah saw trouble. She watches everything he warned, and she listens too well. Cornelius was more calculating, suggesting in a letter that her inheritance might be managed advantageously if she were brought into the fold or eliminated as a liability. For her part, Constance seemed genuinely grateful at first. Her early letters to a childhood friend in England described the brothers as distant but kind, and she expressed hope for a peaceful life in Newfield. Yet the cracks would soon appear. The brothers had spent years crafting a theater where every actor obeyed their script. What they hadn't prepared for was a new character who refused to follow their cues and who just might pull back the curtain. Early suspicions and private investigations. It didn't take long for Constance's innate intelligence and quiet curiosity to place her at odds with her uncle's carefully constructed world. About 3 months after her arrival, while cleaning Obadiah's study, she stumbled upon a compartment in his medical cabinet containing small vials labeled in a cipher she couldn't decipher. The substances were unlike any of the standard herbal treatments Obadiah used in the apothecary. When she asked about them, his response was swift and cold, an uncharacteristic departure from his usual calm demeanor. He warned her sternly not to tamper with his research materials, claiming they were dangerous and meant only for advanced study. The incident might have ended there, had Constance not witnessed something that disturbed her to her core just weeks later. While accompanying the brothers to help tend to the Thatcher children, she glimpsed through a half-closed door as Obadiah administered a dark liquid to the dying Thomas Thatcher, a prominent farmer. Within an hour, Mr. Thatcher was muttering about celestial beings and visions of divine figures. Cornelius, as always, was sitting at the bedside, recording the utterances, while subtly guiding the conversation with questions like, "And does the Lord show you who should care for your fields, or who now owns the mill you built?" To others, these were sacred final moments. To Constance, they were staged, choreographed, artificial. Over the weeks that followed, she began to see patterns, the focus on property owners with no heirs, the subtle manipulation of emotions during spiritual talks, the consistent presence of Cornelius at the signing of wills. She noticed how the elixir's dosage seemed to vary based on the individual Obadiah, adjusting tinctures like a chef, preparing a complex recipe, not a healer treating the sick. Yet Constance remained silent. As a young, unmarried woman, she had no social power. Accusing 3 of the most respected men in Newfield without proof could result not just in disbelief, but in her own punishment, perhaps accusations of hysteria or even possession. Instead, she began keeping a secret journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Every date, every visit, every death, every observation went into its pages. Quietly, methodically, she became her uncle's most dangerous opponent, a witness who was watching not with fear, but with clarity. Discovery of the hidden laboratory. The real turning point came in the winter of 665, when a snowstorm blanketed Newfield in thick isolation for days. The brothers, summoned to assist a dying elder in a neighboring farm, left Constance alone in the house. For the first time, she had access without supervision, and she took it. Guided by memory and suspicion, she searched the home from cellar to attic. Behind a stack of firewood in the basement, she discovered what would later be described as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in colonial America, the Petons laboratory. The room was cold and dry, protected from the elements. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars and vials containing dried substances and powders, some labeled in code, others more clearly marked, belladonna, opium, wolf's bane, and other psychoactives. On a table rested a journal open to a page listing measurements based on weight and age. Another shelf housed detailed anatomical diagrams, copied by hand from what she later realized were medical texts stolen from English universities. There were maps of the human brain, crude but recognizable, and calculations for how much of a substance would induce suggestibility without full unconsciousness. Most horrifying was a locked cabinet which Constance pried open with a fire poker. Inside were personal effects lockets of hair scraps of clothing, brooches and trinkets, each labeled with a name and date. These weren't just trophies. In Obadiah's notes, she read references to resonant anchors, items used to make the drug-induced visions more convincing by triggering memories and associations in the victim's mind. But the most chilling discovery was the ledger. In Cornelius's pristine handwriting, it listed the value of each estate acquired, the method of persuasion, and at the very end, one ominous entry, CP inheritance from maternal grandmother, to be secured upon her 18th year. Constance froze. The initials were hers, the inheritance was hers, and the plan was unmistakable. Planning her escape journal. Entries and the final night, with a horrifying truth now undeniable. Constance knew her time was limited. She had uncovered too much. The brothers were not only fraudsters, they were killers. And now she was next. In her hidden journal, she recorded her plan in a cautious detail. Her goal: escape Newfield and reach Hertford, where colonial authorities might believe her, especially if she carried evidence. It was a daring idea, one that would require precision secrecy and a bit of luck. She began preparing quietly. She sold small embroidery pieces in secret to gather money. She secured a small bundle of clothing and wrapped the most incriminating documents in oilcloth to protect them from the elements. The date she chose was April 15th, 1666. On that day, a merchant convoy was expected to pass through Newfield en route to Hertford. She hoped to join them posing as a traveler's relative or a maid in search of work. In the days leading up to her escape, however, the brothers grew increasingly observant. Jeremiah asked more about her spiritual life. Cornelius made comments about her grandmother's estate. Most unsettling of all was Obadiah, who began taking her cup and brush, claiming concern for her melancholy. Her instincts screamed danger. The night before her planned escape, she wrote a final entry. Uncle O prepared a special tea this evening. Said it would help me sleep. I pretended to sip, but poured it out when unobserved. If I do not reach Hertford, let this journal speak for me. She signed her name and pressed the book back beneath the floorboard. She fell asleep that night, fully clothed, the evidence hidden beneath her cloak, her ears attuned to every creak in the floorboards above. Morning came. The convoy would arrive soon, but fate or the brothers had other plans. The disappearance and death of Constance. The next morning, Constance was seen briefly in the town square, bundled in a travel cloak, speaking with the blacksmith's wife and asking about the merchant convoy. Witnesses described her as alert, composed, and seemingly ready to leave. But within an hour, she was gone. Jeremiah was the last to speak with her publicly. He approached her in the square, exchanged a few words, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her back toward the house. After that, no one saw her alive again. By midday, Obadiah was raising alarm, claiming that his niece had wandered off in a feverish state. He told concerned townsfolk that she had been unwell, speaking in confused phrases and sleepwalking during the night. Several people recalled interacting with her that morning and reported she seemed fine, lucid, even determined. But the brothers had already shaped the narrative. Constance had fallen victim to a father's melancholy, a hereditary affliction that clouded the mind and spirit. For 3 days the town searched. Jeremiah led prayers while Cornelius coordinated the search routes. It was later noted that the areas closest to the Peton house were searched last. On the 3rd day, Constance's body was found in the woods nearly a mile away. Obadiah declared her death a tragic end to inherited madness. Jeremiah delivered a sermon about God's mysterious will. The town wept, but no one looked closer until someone discovered her journal. Rebecca Wilson's discovery and the journal's impact. Good wife. Rebecca Wilson had been helping with household chores in the Peton home since the funeral. Tasked with cleaning Constance's room, she noticed a floorboard that shifted beneath her feet. Curious and cautious, she pried it open and found the small leather-bound journal tucked inside. Unable to read herself, she brought it to her husband, Thomas Wilson, one of the few literate men in the settlement. What he read chilled him to his core. The entries detailed everything: the coded medicines, the forced hallucinations, the manipulation of wills, and Constance's final plan to escape. Thomas, a careful man, knew confronting the Petons directly would likely cost him his life. Instead, he made a copy of the journal and gave it to a traveling friend, asking him to deliver it to the magistrate in Hartford. 2 weeks later, Thomas Wilson accepted an invitation to dine at the Petton home. He fell violently ill the next morning. His visions and ravings before death were described by Jeremiah as the soul confessing its guilt. But those close to him knew better. Within days, the copy of Constance's journal had reached Hartford, and a quiet but determined investigation was underway. Hartford's investigation and the undercover operation. The Hartford authorities approached the matter with caution. The Petons were respected across the region, and the evidence, while disturbing, came from a young woman now deceased. Still, the journal's details were too specific, too consistent with patterns of death and inheritance to be dismissed. The court appointed an agent, Thomas Bradford, to infiltrate Newfield, posing as a merchant suffering from a wasting illness. Bradford took up lodging and began interacting with the brothers. Almost immediately, Obadiah began treating him with bitter-tasting medicines. Soon he reported confusion, fragmented thoughts, and intense dreams. Jeremiah took interest in his soul's salvation. Cornelius visited regularly to help settle affairs. Bradford, sending secret dispatches to Hartford, confirmed every detail of Constance's account. The brothers' operation was still active and still lethal. By early 1667, the colony had enough. A delegation of armed officials traveled to Newfield with orders to arrest the Petons and seize their records, but they were too late. The night before their arrival, a fire engulfed the Peton home. Locals said they heard nothing until the flames were already high. The structure was destroyed. No bodies were recovered, but the fire was deemed accidental, or was it the disappearance of the Peton brothers? The timing of the fire was too convenient to ignore. Officially, it was said that the Peton brothers perished in their sleep, though how no one heard their cries and why no remains were found remains suspicious. Some townspeople believed it was divine justice, others whispered of escape. And soon those whispers grew louder. In 1668, as a new owner began rebuilding on the Peton land, a hidden cellar was discovered untouched by fire. Inside were vials, journals, and, most disturbingly, personal items, from Constance's hair clippings, fingernail fragments, a piece of cloth from the dress she had worn the day she disappeared. A final journal entry, written in Cornelius's careful hand, was dated the night before the fire. The girl's journal has been found. Wilson has betrayed us. Hertford will send men. All must be cleansed by fire. We must begin anew elsewhere. From that moment, the brothers were no longer presumed dead. They were fugitives. Colonial officials circulated their descriptions, scouring ports and roads from Massachusetts to Virginia. But the brothers had disappeared, vanished like smoke. Rediscovery in 1668 ruins, preserved evidence. When workers began clearing the remnants of the Peton home in the spring of 1668, they expected to find ashes and stone, nothing more than charred remains of a scandal. Instead, they unearthed something far more damning, a concealed cellar beneath the foundation, protected by stone insulation and untouched by the fire. It was as though the fire had been designed to burn the visible world above while preserving the secrets below. Inside, investigators found hundreds of vials, each carefully labeled, containing dried remnants of psychoactive substances. Alongside them were journals dating back to 1647, preserved meticulously in waxed cloth. The entries detailed dosage experiments, victim responses, and procedural refinements. It was a laboratory more suited to an 18th century chemist than a 17th century frontier doctor. One shelf contained what appeared to be personal relics: hair braids, buttons, lace kerchiefs, wedding rings. Each item was tagged with a name and a date. These were not mere mementos. According to Obadiah's notes, these items were used to anchor memory during administration of the elixir, increasing the victim's responsiveness by evoking emotional familiarity. But the most damning item was a small leather-bound ledger in Cornelius's hand. The final entry read, "The girl's journal has been found. Wilson has betrayed us. Hertford will send men. All must be cleansed by fire. We must begin anew elsewhere. Providence has delivered us this far. It shall not forsake us now." It was clear the fire was no accident. It was a cover-up and a calculated exit. With this new discovery, colonial officials could no longer dismiss the case as ambiguous. The brothers had faked their deaths, destroyed evidence, and escaped. What remained now was a haunting question: where had they gone? The Preston and Penworth sightings, did they return under new names? In the years that followed the Peton disappearance, unsettlingly familiar stories began to surface in other colonies. In 1670, 3 brothers arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, under the name Preston. One opened an apothecary. Another became a local preacher. The third established himself as a legal consultant. Their arrival coincided with a sudden uptick in deathbed conversions, visions, and will revisions among elderly landowners. Then, in 1673, an investigation into a series of suspicious deaths was quietly launched by Virginia officials. Before any formal accusations could be made, the Prestons disappeared overnight, leaving behind a locked cellar containing distillation equipment, coded journals, and forged documents eerily similar to the Newfield case. 5 years later, across the Atlantic in Bristol, England, 3 middle-aged men arrived under the surname Penworth. They claimed to be returning colonists bringing wealth from the New World. One became a physician to the elderly. One entered the clergy. One became a solicitor specializing in estate law. Over time, wealthy elderly parishioners who lacked heirs began having divine dreams shortly before making generous bequests to the Penworths' institutions. In 1683, the Penworth residence was destroyed by fire. No bodies were recovered. Again, though never officially confirmed, these patterns, 3 skilled men, complementary professions. Sudden wealth, unexplained visions before death. and mysterious disappearances were too consistent to ignore. Many historians believe these were the Peton brothers adapting and perfecting their scheme across continents, using fire as both destruction and rebirth. The brothers had become ghosts, moving from colony to colony, name to name, leaving only smoke, death, and silence in their wake. The Witness Statute of 1670, legal repercussions. While the Petons vanished from public view, their legacy remained etched not in tombstones, but in law. In 1670, prompted by growing concern and increased reports of deathbed manipulations, the Connecticut Colonial Legislature passed a groundbreaking reform, the Witness Statute. This law required all last-minute changes to wills to be witnessed by at least two unrelated parties with no potential claim to the estate. It also prohibited anyone who stood to benefit from serving as a witness to a will. More importantly, it forbade clergy and physicians from simultaneously acting as legal executors unless approved by an independent magistrate. While the law made no explicit mention of the Peton case, its intent was unmistakable to prevent the abuse of spiritual and medical authority for personal gain. The statute represented a rare instance of colonial law directly confronting the intersection of belief science and power. It acknowledged something deeply uncomfortable, that those who minister to the body and soul must be watched just as carefully as those who guard the purse. The Witness Statute would become a foundational precedent cited in later cases throughout the colonies. It also became part of early American legal education, a reminder to aspiring lawyers, ministers, and physicians of the dark potential hidden behind authority without oversight. In quiet tones, professors would reference the unnamed case from Newfield, a cautionary tale whispered more than cited and rarely spoken of directly in public discourse. Dr. Hawthorne's rediscovery and the Yale investigation. For more than 3 centuries, the Peton case remained a fragmented memory, sealed in legal records, dismissed as legend, or reduced to mere footnotes in colonial studies. That changed in 1998 when Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a Yale medical historian specializing in early palliative care, stumbled upon references to the brothers in Jonathan Edwards' private papers. Her curiosity piqued, she began tracing the citations backward, leading her to a misfiled archive box at the Connecticut Historical Society. Inside were the full transcripts of the original investigation, including testimonies, the undercover agent's letters, and most precious of all, Constance Peton's journal. Preserved through centuries of bureaucratic neglect, the journal proved to be both a personal tragedy and a forensic breakthrough. Dr. Hawthorne and her team began compiling a list of the Petons' victims, cross-referencing death records, property transfers, and known wills. What shocked modern researchers wasn't just the brothers' deception, but their sophistication. Modern analysis of the elixir's described effects led pharmacologists to conclude it was a calculated blend of opium belladonna and other psychoactives. Dosages were tailored by gender, age, and temperament, creating a semi-conscious, highly suggestible state. The elixir functioned like a primitive truth serum, but with the twist of spiritual hallucination. Victims believed they were in direct communion with God, and their words became self-fulfilling legal prophecies. It was an unholy Trinity pharmacology theology, and law used as tools of exploitation. Dr. Hawthorne's rediscovery sparked a new era of interdisciplinary study. Historians, pharmacologists, theologians, and ethicists joined forces to examine the broader implications. How often had similar manipulations occurred in early history, but gone undetected? How many other constances had never been heard? Exploiting the power of trust, faith, fear, and fraud. The success of the Peton brothers was not rooted merely in drugs or deception. It stemmed from a profound understanding of human vulnerability. They operated at the fault line between fear and faith, exploiting the most intimate moments of life, the moment of death. When people were most afraid, most uncertain, and most desperate for meaning, the Petons were there with answers beautiful, spiritual, fatal. Their control was absolute because they understood the trust inherent in their roles. A physician's word was law to the sick. A minister's guidance was sacred to the grieving. A magistrate's ink made truth from paper. The Petons were all three. In a society that prized piety and authority, they became untouchable not because they were invisible, but because they were revered. Even those who sensed something was wrong, like Elder Fletcher or Thomas Wilson, hesitated to speak. To doubt the Petons was to doubt God's hand. To accuse them was to accuse the very people who had comforted one's dying relatives. The manipulation was not just of individuals, but of an entire worldview. Their method became a playbook for how evil can cloak itself in virtue. It is not only a story about the past, it is a warning to the present. The Petons remind us that the most dangerous predators are those who speak softly, wear robes of trust, and move through sacred spaces unnoticed. The fate of Constance. A heroine lost a legacy, preserved. Constance Peton never lived to see the impact of her bravery. She died alone, likely terrified in a wilderness she had tried to escape through truth. Yet in death her voice endured, preserved in ink, protected under a floorboard, and ultimately read by the world she could not reach in life. While the Peton brothers attempted to erase her through poison and fire, it was Constance who ultimately exposed them. Not through confrontation, but through careful documentation, she ensured that their crimes would not disappear into colonial silence. Historians today recognize Constance as one of the earliest documented female whistleblowers in American history. In a society where women's words were often dismissed as hysteria, she wrote with clarity, restraint, and precision. Her journal was not emotional rambling. It was evident strategy and resistance. And it worked. Her death, though tragic, catalyzed a chain of revelations that led to legal reform, historical scrutiny, and the dismantling of a criminal dynasty cloaked in spiritual authority. That her legacy persisted for centuries, tucked away in archives and footnotes, is not a mark of failure, but a testament to the power of hidden truths waiting for someone brave enough to read them. In classrooms and legal seminars, her name is whispered alongside other early figures of moral courage. But to those who truly understand her story, Constance is more than a historical figure. She is a symbol of resistance, of the silent watching eye, and of the quiet voice that, when recorded, can thunder across centuries. The Petons as a template for future abuse. Though the Peton brothers' exact fate remains unknown, their methods echo far beyond 17th century Newfield. In the decades after their disappearance, similar cases emerged across the colonies and in Europe, 3 men appearing suddenly offering care to the dying, guiding visions, rewriting wills. Some of these may have been copycats, but others may well have been the Petons themselves adapting rebranding and continuing their grim ministry. What the Petons created was not merely a scam, it was a structure. A process, a system built on psychological insight and societal blind spots. Their elixir was only one ingredient in a much broader recipe that included religious manipulation, legal advantage, and emotional exploitation. They proved that when a group controls the means of spiritual assurance, physical relief, and legal finality, they can weaponize that control to take everything, even a person's death. In a chilling sense, the Peton brothers anticipated the abuses of future systems: corrupt clergy, manipulating the dying, unethical doctors, drugging patients into compliance, unscrupulous lawyers, drafting documents for profit. Their crime wasn't just individual, it was archetypal. And that is perhaps the most disturbing legacy. They showed others what was possible when conscience is replaced with cunning, and when power is draped in the garments of trust. Legal, medical, and religious scholars reflect the case of the Petons brothers has since become a pivotal case study for scholars across disciplines. Legal historians examine it as one of the earliest documented inheritance frauds that relied on coercive spiritual influence. Medical ethicists study the elixir's composition, noting its surprisingly advanced use of opiates and hallucinogens. Theological scholars, perhaps most deeply disturbed, reflect on how their manipulation of scripture and spiritual expectation turned faith into a trap. Modern commentary often centers on the fact that the Petons succeeded not by force, but by persuasion. Their crimes were executed not with violence, but with quiet, sacred authority. They didn't break into homes, they were invited into bedrooms. They didn't steal land, they were gifted it in ceremonies of grace and prayer. Dr. Melissa Thornton of Johns Hopkins University notes, the Petons created a pharmacological theology where divine inspiration was chemically induced and legal truth was spiritually justified. It remains one of the most elegant and terrifying intersections of manipulation ever recorded in the early modern world. Their ability to occupy three spheres, medicine, religion, and law, gave them unprecedented access. And because they operated in a time where questioning authority was both dangerous and discouraged, their scheme could flourish undetected for decades. The case today stands as a multidisciplinary warning. No structure is safe from corruption unless it is questioned, diversified, and accountable. A mirror for our modern vulnerabilities. Though separated from us by centuries, the Petons case reflects vulnerabilities still present in modern societies. We still place deep trust in doctors, ministers, and legal professionals, often without demanding oversight. We still fear death and long for meaning in our final days. We still hope that those around us, especially in moments of crisis, are acting with genuine care. And we are still susceptible to manipulation, cloaked in virtue. The Petons succeeded because they understood not just the systems of their day, but the emotional needs of human beings, our need for comfort, our fear of being forgotten, our desire to be remembered as faithful. These are not colonial weaknesses. They are human ones. Today, we may have more laws, better medicine, and more skeptical societies, but we also have more subtle methods of influence. Media, pharmaceuticals, digital persuasion, and emotional exploitation through manufactured belief systems. The Petons story asks us, how do we protect ourselves and our loved ones from those who speak softly but act with concealed cruelty? It reminds us that evil does not always come snarling in shadow. It often smiles in candlelight and quotes scripture. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters don't break into our homes. They sit at our bedside and whisper prayers. The final question, in whom do we place our trust? In the end, The story of the Peton brothers is not merely about three criminals in colonial Connecticut. It is about us, about how societies build trust and how easily that trust can be turned into a weapon, about how deeply we long for meaning at the edge of death and how dangerous that longing can become when placed in the wrong hands. As you close this story, you may feel a chill, not because of supernatural horror, but because of how plausible it all was. The Petons didn't rely on ghosts or curses. They relied on faith, tradition, and trust. And they used those things as instruments of silence. The final question the Peton story leaves us with is both haunting and urgent. In whom do we place our trust? And what evidence do we require before we dare to question it, even in our most vulnerable moments? Perhaps that more than the vanished brothers or the twisted medicine is the real horror that even now, centuries later, we still struggle to ask that question aloud. But maybe with stories like this, preserved, not buried, we will learn to look more closely, listen more carefully, and demand accountability from even the holiest of hands. Because evil does not always arrive with horns and claws. Sometimes it arrives with a prayer book, a stethoscope, and a pen.